everyone. I'm really excited to be presenting at this conference with my colleague Sara Acevedo. My name is Alka Aurora. I'm a professor and department chair in a program called Women's Spirituality at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Our program offers a PhD in philosophy and religion with a concentration in women's spirituality and an MA in women, gender, spirituality, and social justice. And my own work is located at the intersection of feminism, specifically ecofeminism and women of color feminisms, with other issues of social justice, animal studies, animal ethics, and very importantly, spirituality.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Alka. I'm super excited to be presenting with you here too. My name is Sara Acevedo. I am a neurodivergent mestiza educator, activist, scholar, and disability justice advocate. I'm also a PhD student in the Anthropology and Social Change Department at the California Institute of Integral Studies, where my focus is disability justice. So we're here today to talk to you about our conversations around the intersections of disability, animality, and gender. These conversations started around a year ago, where we started to realize that our work in social justice was beginning to merge in very unexpected and interesting ways. And so we decided to actually come together and write a little bit more extensively about this and share our ideas with you today. So our first point was we started talking about how disability justice issues have always been neglected or thought of in terms of a subcategory or sort of like a last item in the checklist in social justice debates. And we started thinking about ways in how to remedy this at a smaller scale within our own institution. And so we started thinking about ways in which this so-called oppression Olympics, in which people find themselves competing for who's more oppressed than whom, and what oppression or what kind of oppression is more important. And we wanted to address that in this conversation. So one of the things that had us thinking about bodies in intersection was the way that our bodies and our embodiment and our carnality exists is very complex, very layered, and very multiple. And so we want to address that in this conversation by saying that our bodies, more concretely than discursively, because as you know, disabled bodies, animal bodies, and human beings and non-human animals are thought of as deviant and as marginal, because we tend to think about these bodies along sociological categories, as opposed to thinking about these bodies within concrete situations and very extreme living conditions. So our bodies cannot be disassembled as they are discursively in concrete ways, as it were limb by limb and bone by bone. So we want to start to address that and to think about that we're not only women, and we're not only women of color, and we're not only disabled, and we're not only transgender, and we're not only gender non-conforming, and we're not only black or brown, we're all these things, and at certain times all of these identity markers merge within one body sometimes. And so how do we address those issues? How do we talk about these intersections in ways that are fruitful and that sort of lead us to more engaged conversations around intersectionality?
Thank you.
Sure.
I think one of the other ways that's been really exciting to work with you is that we both are very grounded in our own sense of spirituality. And as I mentioned earlier, that's a big part of my work. Now I want to clarify that a little bit. When I talk about spirituality, I'm not talking about religion per se, although my own spiritual practices have been informed largely by Eastern traditions. I grew up Hindu and have studied quite a bit of Buddhism, but I've also been a student of other sacred traditions around the globe, particularly to the extent that they honor the divine feminine, which is an important part of my work. But when I talk about spirituality, I'm talking specifically in this context about the sense of the sacred value of all life and of every being, and the inherent value and dignity of all being, and the sense of interconnectedness, and the sense of being connected to and concerned about other beings beyond their utility to us. And I would like to argue as well that, all traditions, whether the pre-patriarchal traditions and even patriarchal religious traditions, have historically had this idea of all of life having some inherent value that's not reducible to profit and consumption. But in today's era of transnational capitalism, in which a lot of these older religious frameworks have been breaking down, and oftentimes, it's been important for some of these frameworks to break down because they've been very patriarchal. But nonetheless, they've been replaced by a form of rampant capitalism in which there's no sense of the sacred. Mm-hmm. There's no sense that life or beings are sacred or have value outside of their participation in the circulation of profit and consumption.
Yeah, and in a sense, transnational capitalism has become yet another religion. That we abide by. So, sort of like trying to reevaluate the ethos of the sacredness of inherent value of life versus the value of life that's profitable and that is out for consumption, and that it continues and reproduces the circle of capital throughout the world, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. So one of the other points that I think you had wanted, that we've been talking about, is about the idea of the abject.
Yes, and we started talking about the idea of the abject in relation to consumption, I started talking to Alka about the relationships between how animals, non-human animals, have been used for profit, not only in the sense of animals that are out for physical consumption, but also animals that have been used for spectacle and for their visuality. And so thinking about the circus, thinking about the rodeo, thinking about even the hunting of Cecil the lion, which was so controversial, and it was not long ago that we were talking about these issues. And so I mentioned to Alka how there's a lot of parallels between this idea of the spectacle for non-human animals and for disabled body, and the idea of the spectacle in relation to the consumption of and the visuality and the spectacle of difference and human difference, and the roots in cultural spectacles such as the freak show, right? And where bodies, disabled bodies and different bodies were paraded for consumption.
Absolutely.
Right? And this was not long ago.
Absolutely.
We're talking 19th century, end of 18th century. So we're finding a lot of connections as we go, and I think it's really important to think of the abject, as linguist Julia Kristeva talks about, as a projection of our own undesirability onto others and onto sort of like made deviant subjectivities that circulate in popular narratives and literature and in pop culture today.
Absolutely, and I would add that the sense of the body as spectacle has also been true of women's bodies, and we see that every single day in advertising. We've seen that with black bodies, with brown bodies, and there's that horrific history of African American bodies being in zoos and on displays, and we all know about that, and that's been extremely problematic, as well as transgender bodies or gender deviant bodies.
Yeah.
I recall growing up, the only sort of representation I've ever saw of trans bodies was on modern freak shows like Jerry Springer and those sorts of shows, and so these are all ways in which the concept of the body as sacred has been replaced by the concept of the body as a spectacle to be consumed. Yes. Particularly marginalized bodies.
Yes, and the whole fetishism and fetishization of bodies for consumption within heteronormative relationships of domination. But that's another whole conversation that we can't get into right now, but just for you to see the many connections that we are making with each other's work.
Absolutely. The other connection that we've made is really about this concept of vulnerability and how both within the oppression of disabled bodies and of non-human animal bodies has been the denial of the one in power of their own vulnerability. So we see this, again in transnational capitalism and in Western society particularly, but all over the globe, this concept of the hypermasculine, autonomous subject who lacks vulnerability, and not only lacks vulnerability, he is able to conquer his own vulnerability. So we see this, for instance, in the rodeos or bullfighting shows where powerful creatures that remind us of our own vulnerability because we are vulnerable.
Yeah, we've forgotten about our reptile brain, right? We've created this illusion, this division between animality and rationality, right? It's along Kantian lines that it's like propel these ideas of the tameable and those who tame and are able to overcome their own vulnerability and interdependence.
Yeah,
right?
So you see both the material and the symbolic conquering of vulnerability.
Yeah.
On a more mundane, level, we see this often in heterosexual relationships where the man, rejects his own vulnerability or projects it onto the woman.
Absolutely.
And I would argue that this comes up in all sorts of relationships. It comes up in our relationship to the earth and non-human animals, and denying our own dependence and
on
vulnerability and our dependence on the earth, and this absolute invisibilization.
Yeah, and I really like the way you put it the other day. You said something like, we are not on earth, we are off the earth. Yes. So this division, this binary is such a fiction.
Yeah.
But we've forgotten about it, and we've sort of like created a whole paradigm of knowledge and of thought based on this fictional division, right? And the tameable. So you were just talking about how the spectacle again with animals and the tameable, right? And so there's a parallel there that we can talk about, sort of the conquering of the madman, right? After the release of the prisoners from La Bastille, and how the madman was chained to walls and naked, and then liberated to then be institutionalized and put on the observation by the psychiatric profession, right? And so and the same with the wild woman. We were talking about this, and we started thinking about the witch hunts and how wild women who were independent and interdependent within matriarchal groups, but how their independence was forged through their own interdependence with the earth, and sort of making their own contraceptives from the earth, using herbs and using nature. And engaging in all kinds of liberatory actions like extramarital relationships, and sort of like a sisterhood and a community around the earth. So honoring the sacredness of the earth while honoring the sacredness of the liberated woman. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think I want to speak here too, not just the sort of the problematics we're seeing in our contemporary culture, but also the power of vulnerability. And I can speak from a personal perspective to the extent that I've been able to actually get in touch with and feel through and honor my vulnerability, the extent which I actually become more in relationship to others and more resilient as well. And I think that it's by recognizing our shared vulnerability with all beings. So for instance, for the able-bodied person to recognize themselves as in many ways temporarily able-bodied, and to recognize that the casting off or the othering of the disabled body has a lot to do with our own fear of our own vulnerability to illness and to disease and to challenges of life, and so, but by recognizing and truly honoring and not just fearing our vulnerability can bring us into more of a sense of compassion and sacred relationship with the other. And I think it is that sense of care and compassion and love that's really truly going to help us shift these paradigms from domination and conquest into sacred interdependence.
Yes, and along those lines, the very creation of the woman or self-identified woman body as a dangerous sort of figure that's threatened in this idea of independence and high individuation and the good consumer, right, which is inscribed within the late liberal or neoliberal paradigm of consumption, right? Whereas the liberation of women is threatening this very constructions and the foundations of heteropatriarchal forms of being in and knowing the world. And the same goes for disabled bodies, right? So the liberation, the self-liberation of disabled bodies, and the creation of a disability culture that honors vulnerability and that honors interdependence, it's really threatening to the status quo. So it's a big issue, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And then the other, I think one of the other major connections we found between our work on disability justice and animal ethics and animal studies is around the issue of language and communication. So within the Western tradition, in the recent several hundred years, the major split between human and non-human animals has been predicated upon this concept of language, and the fact that non-human animals are not like us. They lack rationality. They lack language. And all research that's actually been done to challenge this has been very controversial because it starts to break down the human and non-human animal divide. And what I want to argue is that, well, first of all, this concept that rationality or language use is in and of itself a measuring stick by which someone should be dominated or not dominated.
And granted dignity. Right? And it happens to disabled bodies, right?
Exactly. Or consumed or not consumed.
Yes.
It is really problematic in and of itself because, again, it's focused on a disembodied, objectified concept of value. But further, I want to argue that non-human animals and nature itself does communicate.
Absolutely.
And beyond, the ways in which certain primates have been learned to sign and whatnot. I mean, that's also very true, but that's not
problematic.
That's not what I'm referring to here. I'm referring to the cry of the dairy cow when her calf is taken from her, the trampling of houses by an elephant when their native habitat has been destroyed,
right.
And these otherwise generally gentle creatures become
within
angry.
Prolonged captivity, right?
Yeah, become angry and are speaking up and are communicating the injustice in their own way, and how we as human animals have to be willing to perceive and listen to and understand these other ways of communicating.
Right, and before when we were talking about this, and you also said, you brought up something that was really, really important and touching, was that the fear and the cries that non-human animals emit when they are faced with the butcher's knife, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And I thought about this parallel in thinking about how disabled bodies who have been throughout history being medicalized, right? And so their lives have been written along medical terms and medical histories, and that same fear that sort of overcomes us as we encounter the doctor's knives, right? And this perpetual quest for a perfect body or a non-disabled body, right? That is assimilated and it imitates the able body, right? So the idea of fixing, the idea of curing, the idea of hiding disability has been one of the main sort of quests for the medical establishment, right? And beginning with psychiatry, right? The sifting of the mind, the understanding and the changing of the mind, the taming of the madman in its delusion, right?
Absolutely. And so a lot of our work is about, again, just to reiterate, bringing a sense of the inherent value and dignity of beings, irrespective of how and when they choose to communicate with us, and how, or if we're able to actually perceive and listen to their communication.
Absolutely. And what is language, right?
Yeah.
When we are piecing apart this very patriarchal, very Western-centric and male-centric ideas of language and what language is appropriate and what language is standard, the autistic movement and the neurodiversity movement is seeking justice through the argument that we all communicate, that we all have language, and that the fact that we are nonverbal doesn't mean that we don't communicate, that we don't have very important things to say, right? So the sort of like the unimportance or the so-called unimportance of assisted communication, facilitated communication, and devices that facilitate communication for non-verbal folks. It's really another crucial point of this whole idea around language and what language is acceptable and what language is intelligible and what language takes less time, right? Which is also feeding into the idea of the circles of capital, the productivity, efficiency, and pace.
Absolutely.
I think we have one last point that we wanted to close with. We've been talking throughout this presentation about how certain subjectivities and how certain embodiments have been deemed closer to nature in terms of wildness, or in terms of irrationality, and in terms of how their ability to be tamed. But we also wanted to bring the other side to this argument, which is those beings and those subjectivities that have been deemed anti-natural. And so we sort of like talked about naming the section contra natura, right? To talk about the experiences, or to touch, sorry, on the experiences of gender non-conforming, transgender, and queer bodies, as well as disabled bodies, within this whole narrative of what is anti-natural. And so we thought about what is natural, what are we meaning when we talk natural here. And so we started with discussing, right, the Judeo-Christian tradition, and the order of things is the order of divine rule, and a very all-encompassing patriarchal God who is setting the rules and setting the status quo. We're not really talking about the natural way of being in connection to the earth. Right? So what is natural is sort of read in terms of what is closer to the ability to produce something, right? What is profitable, because we were talking about that. In that sense, the Judeo-Christian tradition and was sort of replaced as a religion by transnational capitalism as a religion itself. And so we were talking about also the family unit, the heterosexual family unit, and how it has always been a pillar of divine rule, right? And so
and also I wanted to, you mentioned this, that the ways in which gender nonconforming, transgender, and queer subjectivities have been said to destabilize the order of things, to be unnatural, just in ways that disabled people have said to be unnatural, monstrous, freakish. Those are very similar ways in which a very dominator model of spirit, of religion, and of society has been projected a false idea of nature onto nature, and use a discourse of nature while actually not fully bearing witness to the endless variety and diversity of nature. There's an amazing article by a scholar named Patrice Jones called On Eros and the Mechanisms of Eco-Defense, where she talks specifically about queer eros, and how in nature you see all kinds of expressions of affection, love, sexuality, between same-sex members, same-sex animals of the same species, and how this actually can, if we really pay attention to that, challenges and destabilizes our concepts of what's nature, and how the function of love and sex is simply to reproduce.
Exactly. And so what is monstrous of the disabled body, or what is monstrous of the gender non-conforming body within the Judeo-Christian tradition, is like that threat to the heterosexual family unity, and the idea of reproducing the divine order, which is parallel to what is monstrous and what is threatening to the transnational capitalist order, along the same lines of the heterosexual family unit, right, which is the invisible work of women and the reproducing of the next generation of workers, right? So there's two kinds of monstrosities that are being used as tropes and as metaphors that circulate within popular narratives, literature.
Absolutely. And I would argue is that, I think that in some social justice scholarship, I see sort of this desire to do away with the discourse of nature, the natural altogether, and simply talk about social constructionism. Absolutely. But I think that in a way also negates the materiality of our bodies and the concreteness of our experiences, as you mentioned, Sarah. And so I think what we need to do is find ways to shift the discourse about nature and the natural without eradicating it altogether, recognizing this sort of sense of a sacred relationship with nature, and that we still have a lot to learn about what that means, and what it means to truly listen to and be in relationship to, and not to just project our own dominator human, contemporary human, values onto.
And you were saying something so beautiful before. It's like this idea of this magical or mysterious side of nature, right? It's being completely dismantled in favor of predictability.
Yes.
So everything that we don't know about the earth, we assume it to be predictable by human means. And this is all done in order to reproduce the circulation of capital in the intersystem, transnational economic system that we're living within right now. So it's that separation between nature as magical, mysterious, and unpredictable, and how can we predict nature so we can predict and amplify profit.
Absolutely. And I see here that we're out of time.
We are.
I think we could just keep talking and talking, but we really look forward to your questions. And really glad to be part of this conference. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Anthony, for inviting us to participate. Goodbye, everybody.